Maybe you think, I'm secure. Well, you may not always be secure. Or maybe you're anxious. Well, one of the things about learning these styles is to be able to understand, why am I anxious? This is to see the dance that you're doing, to see the steps that you take in a relationship that cause you or your relationship to suffer. You may want to be in a relationship, but you don't know how. You may struggle with communication, but you think that what you're doing is the right way to do it because that's what you know how to do. That's why these attachment styles are so valuable.
Welcome to the Divorce Support Podcast, the podcast that aims to uncover how people successfully let go and move on during and after divorce. Divorce is one of the most difficult times in life, and yet we show you how you can feel significantly better quickly. The information in this podcast is backed by more than 30 years of courses and thousands of people using the Rebuilders program to let go and move on. We will show you how you can do it too. Get a free personalized assessment of how well you are doing by taking the Divorce Adjustment Self-Test at Rebuilders.net. And if you enjoy this podcast, be sure to leave us a positive review at iTunes, Spotify, Google Play, or wherever you listen to this podcast. Now, let's get started.
Hi, this is Kevin from Rebuilders.net. Today I want to talk about something called attachment styles. And this is an important thing that everyone should really understand about when they're in some sort of relationship or they're just leaving a relationship. It's helpful to understand that everybody has what's called an attachment style. In other words, some sort of a relationship pattern that we do, or some people refer to it as the dance that we do in relationships. Now, this came about back in the 50s. Was a guy named John Bowlby was the first person to really recognize that we have these different ways of being in relationships, and he was able to distinguish some basic types that people do. And there's a little bit of a background on it in that what he found was that your relationship style is based on how you were raised by your parents. So there's two parts to it. One is, how did your parents treat you when you reached out for help or need or safety? And then how did you respond to that? So what happened beyond, within that? What did you learn as ways to survive and get your needs met? Now, if you're listening to this on the podcast, I'm going to put this presentation on a link on the podcast so that you can see it to be able to do it. But I'm going to do my best to try to explain it verbally. Okay, so the first thing is that there is 4 different relationship styles. And I'm going to put them into a grid. So think of it like a box with 4 corners. The bottom left is the attachment style is called secure. Above that is what's called avoidant. Now, some people will call this dismissive, avoidant dismissing, avoidant dismissive. There's a few different ways that it gets termed, but this is the main one is called avoidant. On the top right is fearful, or some people call this fearful avoidant. And then in the bottom right is anxious or preoccupied. Okay, so the way this works is, and the basic element of it is that if you go from the left side, the secure and avoidant side, to the right side, which has fearful and anxious, you go from what's typically a low anxiety in a relationship to a high anxiety. So the more, say, fearful or anxious you are, you might have a higher anxiety about being in a relationship. Now, there's also a different direction, which is top to bottom. So there's what's considered avoidance. So the secure and the anxious people have a low avoidance, whereas the avoidant and fearful have a high avoidance. I just want to point out, some places out there will only use 3 different types of attachment styles, and some will use 4. I like the 4 because it distinguishes a little bit more, and it also makes it a little bit easier to read. But there are some places where like John Bowlby originally came out with 3, and then the 4th was really found. But I like this because there's some really important things to understand, that there are some, in a grid, you can see where there's differences in how this relates. And I'll explain this in a minute. All right. Now, one of the things about these 4 different styles is that it's one of those things where it's not appropriate to think about these as you are one of these people. In other words, there's a spectrum in every category and how you relate. And it also varies depending on how safe you feel in a relationship. So some people will be feel very fearful all the time, but other people might say, like in avoidant, they might say, I've got some avoidance, and but I can fall into the secure category more often. Or you might be very extreme. You might be extremely fearful. In other words, high avoidance and high anxiety. That's possible. Or you might be very solidly in one category. It's by the person, and it's also by the circumstance that people tend to be in these. However, we tend to fall to the level of our less secure types. Now, I want to try and give some various ways of looking at these different styles. So the first one is people that are secure in their relationships. They tend to have a relationship that is interdependent. They are comfortable with emotional intimacy. They're comfortable with closeness. They have healthy relationship bonds. They are secure and trusting. Avoidant people are independent. They are or self-reliant. They're difficult to get close with others. They find it difficult to get close with others. They put up walls and they leave or avoid during conflict. People that are fearful, they seek closeness yet avoid closeness at the same time. There's like a push-pull. They tend to be disorganized. They're fearful of making connections with others, and they can be self-harming or abusive. And then the last one in the bottom right corner is anxious. They tend to be dependent in their relationship. They have a fear of losing their relationship. They have emotional highs and lows. They can be aggressive, and they're clingy on separation. Now, what I like about the 4 attachment styles model that I'm showing here is that one of the things I like is that the secure and anxious, if you look from left to right, those two have a positive view of others. In other words, when you're secure, you might see your partner as that they're a good person. If you're anxious, you might see, hey, they're a good person on the other side. However, the avoidant and the fearful in the top row have a negative view of others. In other words, they're avoidant because they think that other person, might hurt them in some way, or they're fearful because they think that there's something about that other person that isn't gonna, might be not safe. Now, in the same way, if you look at the chart, on the left side, the avoidant and the secure, the two on the left, they have a positive view of their self. So the avoidant says, hey, I'm okay, but it's the other person that's not okay. Whereas the secure says they have a positive view of others and a positive view of themselves. Now, on the right side, fearful and anxious, they both have a negative view of themselves, but the fearful person has a negative view of others and a negative view of themselves, whereas the anxious person has a positive view of others, but a negative view of themselves. Now, these are referred to as the model of other and the model of self. So I like this because it really breaks down that people have different levels of their view of themselves and of others. And that's really important to distinguish that those are two very different things. And it matters in relationships. All right, some other ways that people would describe these is that the person who is secure tends to be warm and caring, trusting and forgiving. They have appropriate conflict when there's a problem, and they manage their emotion well, and they're honest and open. Now, people that are avoidant tend to be more emotionally distant. They prefer individuality. They don't really depend on their partner. They avoid conflict, and they tend to be very logical. Also, people that are fearful, their emotions are messy. They often have unresolved trauma that resurfaces often angry. They have aggressive behaviors, and they often lack empathy. Now, the last one, anxious in the bottom right, these are people that tend to be insecure. They have a fear of their partner leaving. They have a lack of personal boundaries. And they're always shifting moods, and they're highly sensitive. All right, so now looking at these different categories, there's some other ways to look at this, but the avoidant, fearful, and anxious all have three things in common. They tend to be people that are in a chronic survival mode. There's just a fundamental insecurity there and some high anxiety about the relationship or themselves. People that are secure, however, don't tend to have those. Now, another way of looking at this chart is that people that are more secure tend to have a higher self-esteem, and people that are on the right side, that are fearful and anxious have a low self-esteem. Another way to, on the chart from top to bottom, is that people that are avoidant or fearful have low trust, and people that are secure or anxious have a high trust. Some other things that are really interesting that I found as I was researching this is that people that are secure tend to not be triggered very easily. If they're triggered, they can manage their emotional response well. They can attune to other people's emotions. They have a healthy view of themselves. They speak their wants and needs easily, and they have good self-esteem. This is what most people strive for, is they want to be this way, but we fall short of that sometimes or often. Now, people that are avoidant, their trigger response is either to freeze or to flee. And they don't trust easily. They build up walls. They're ultra independent, and they can be very dismissive. They want intimacy, but they're afraid. Now, people that are fearful, their trigger response varies quite a bit, but there is this push and pull dynamic. They can be confused about what love really is. They downplay relationships, right? It explains a lot for them. And they have trouble feeling emotions. People that are anxious, their trigger response is to fawn or freeze. And they tend to fear abandonment or being alone. They're preoccupied with relationships, and there's a certain codependency. All right, so how common are the attachment styles? Well, some research has shown that 60% are secure, 15% are anxious, 15% are avoidant, and 10% are fearful. Now, we were talking about this in our support group, and the joke was that it might say that 60% are secure, but that means 59% are lying. Everybody during divorce tends to be affected by how secure do they actually feel. It blows everything up. Whereas in a relationship, you might have been pretty secure in your relationship for a while, and then things started to happen, and you drifted away from that. So it varies. It also varies by age. It varies by just what's going on in your life. And so this is not something to think about and say, oh, I'm one of those, and maybe you think I'm secure. Well, you may not always be secure, or maybe you're anxious. Well, one of the things about learning these styles is to be able to understand, why am I anxious? This is to see the dance that you're doing, to see the steps that you take in a relationship that cause you or your relationship to suffer. You may want to be in a relationship, but you don't know how. You may struggle with communication, but you think that what you're doing is the right way to do it because that's what you know how to do. That's why these attachment styles are so valuable, to see that if you don't have the awareness of what you do, well, then you can't really change how you do the dance. So part of what we're doing here is raising this. Now, if you do any of our courses, one of the things we talk about a lot is some of the fundamental concepts underneath feeling secure. You don't have to be stuck being anxious, avoidant, or fearful. But when you understand your thinking underneath it, that's what gives you the power to move into being secure. to be healthy, to understand that there's nothing wrong, that I'm okay, that I'm enough. This is so important. So this is what we do in our programs, is we help people learn how to be secure in their relationships. If you're listening to this on the podcast, I will put the links to the presentation in the podcast, and then they'll also be available on our website. All right, so the last step is, if you want to know more about this, if you want to understand how to do this differently, some other options are 2 books. These 2 books I have read, I have found that are really helpful. The first one is Hold Me Tight, and it's called 7 Conversations for a Lifetime of Love. This is a very heavy book. It's hard to read. It is intense, and yet it is really, really good. So if you're a person that can really sit down and absorb some intense information and really understanding things, this book can change your life and your relationship. It's amazing. She is the developer of something called Emotionally Focused Couple Therapy. And so this is a program that's been built around the attachment theory and how do we do things. And it's really good. It takes a lot of work to do this, but she really is considered one of the best people for taking that and running with what Dr. John Bowlby came up with years ago. Now, the other book here is Wired for Love. This is by Stan Tatkin. And this is a little bit more talking about your attachment style, but he puts it in a little bit more friendly terms and helps you understand how relationships work. I highly recommend it. It's well done and it's fun to read. And it does do some different things around giving you some rules for relationships around how do we do this in a way that works for you and in your relationship. Because there's a lot of things in here that we don't think about of maybe we, for example, we gossip about someone else or our partner and we don't really talk to them about it. So there's some rules that help you learn how to be more secure in your relationships and how to understand where your tendencies lie. So it's really good. I recommend both of those books as also for learning more. If you like this podcast, please let us know, give us feedback, and look for the link to download the different styles as I described them in this audio. Take care. Good luck. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much for listening. We hope you enjoyed today's episode, and we look forward to giving you the next one. Get a free, personalized assessment of how well you're doing by taking the Divorce Adjustment Self-Test at rebuilders.net. And if you enjoyed this podcast, be sure to leave us a positive review at iTunes, Spotify, Google Play, or wherever you listen to this podcast.